Well, whether it's Stephen Harper, Nigel Wright, or Mike Duffy, Justin Trudeau, or Pamela Wallin, when you're caught in a firestorm at some point, you have to decide whether to face the microphones or hide from them. How is that decision made? The insiders on that tonight. David is with the Liberals. Kathleen is with the NDP. She's in Ottawa tonight, by the way. And with Jamie overseas this week, Conservative Bill Fox is back with us tonight. And we start with congratulations to you. A doctorate, you got your PhD. Bill went back to school these last few years. Good for you.
Thank you, Peter.
All right, let's start with the basics here. What's the basic rule on this? You know, facing the cameras or staying silent? David.
Silence breeds suspicion. If you're not filling the vacuum with information, other people will fill that vacuum. And whatever you are not talking about is not likely nearly as bad as what people think you might not be talking about if you hide from the cameras. Get out there, earlier the better.
Kathleen?
I think David's right. There's consequences both for going public or going to ground. But the question you need to ask yourself, if you're going to go public, you need to be able to go to the end of your story. You need to be able to take all of the questions, basically talk it out, everything the media throws at you. And that way, your first foray in going public will not be one of many denials, but will actually be your last admission, and then you can kill the story at the get-go.
All right, Bill, have they left any ground there uncovered?
Well, and that's trickier than it sounds, Peter, because when you're faced with a circumstance that the media will interpret as a crisis or a challenge, first of all, the information you're getting is invariably incomplete, often contradictory. There's a human dimension. You're often talking about people that you know, that you like, that you work with, and that you respect. And then there's an imperative not to let the other side, as David says, frame the story for you. There is going to be a narrative that emerges. You have to be part of that narrative, and sometimes that means you have to move before you have the whole of your story to tell.
All right, well, let's break it down a little bit. Kathleen did a bit in terms of the decision to go public, how to do it. Staying on that theme, what's the best strategy to have when you've decided you're either going to have a news conference or you're going to do an interview? Going into it, how do you prep for that?
First of all, go through the toughest Q&A preparation that you possibly can. Ensure that everything that might conceivably be thrown at you, you have dealt with in preparation before you get out there. Very important not to look defensive, and it's natural to look defensive when you're shocked and threatened by something. So that's point number one. Point number two is don't waste any of your capital defending the indefensible. You need to be able to correct the inaccurate, so save your credibility for that. And the third thing is let people know that you've learned something from that. Create a narrative about how you're going to be better as a consequence of the learned experience you've had from this exercise.
It must be really hard not to look defensive when you suddenly find yourself in that situation. Are there any tricks to that, Kathleen?
Well, I think David hit on it a bit by saying you have to be really well prepared. And part of that process is actually going through what we in politics or in the back rooms kind of call the murder questions. So you would actually rehearse out various questions that could possibly be thrown at you, and some of the worst ones. So you're prepared for all of those questions that will come at you. You also want to control what the parts of the situation that you can. So you want to look at controlling the venue that you actually go public in. What type of interview? Is it a one-on-one? Is it a live interview? Is it a press conference? If you decide to go public, you try to control what you can.
Bill?
Again, there's more art than science to that because there are different combinations and permutations for all those things. But I think you should be guided by one overarching principle, and that is the public, is actually quite tolerant that something occurs. What they want to know is what are you going to do about it? And so one of the things I think you need to do fairly quickly is, first of all, make a statement that speaks to a shared value, make an explicit reference to the specific in terms of either the program or the policy or the issue that's in front of you, and then give them some sense of what you as the leader or the principal is going to do to solve the problem and or fix the problem. Because
but what if you're the problem?
Well, it goes to the way, frankly, the way newscasts in particular are structured. Television news is very effective at identifying the problem and then focusing on the person who has the ability to either solve the problem or to try and duck the problem. And you need to be, and people make assessments about you as a leader or a principal based on how they think you're doing at that.
All right. Well, it would seem to me that all three of you, if you had a preference, would be to go the route of getting out there, making the case as to why, you didn't do anything wrong or whatever the situation may be. What about the other? What about the reverse? When you actually decide, you know what, going out is not the right thing to do. Kathleen, what would possibly have happened to make you make that argument?
Well, in that situation is because you don't want to feed the fire. You don't want to give the story any more oxygen. It often happens where outlandish accusations get hurled at politicians, and it is through the denial that the story actually gets more legs. So you have to ask yourself, if me responding to the story, does the journalist get more credibility or more a foundation to the story by having my denial? So sometimes it is important in that case to go to ground and just say no comment.
Obviously, if you can't make a denial, you probably shouldn't go in front of the microphones either. But what else? I hear what Kathleen's saying. Is there more, David, on that as well?
Well, everybody in politics, other than the leaders, exists in a hierarchical structure. And quite often, people are told not to go out and say anything because there's a strategy in place by the higher-ups to manage this issue, and they don't want you freelancing on that issue. The only problem for the individual is that the strategy that has been put in place is likely designed to protect some other interest, either an institutional interest or the interest of somebody higher up and not that person. So really, they're being asked to take a reputational hit for a larger, more important cause.
But I wonder if that sort of command and control model can survive in a social media age. In an earlier time, you could designate a spokesperson, you could target a certain number of media outlets, you could get some key messages out there, and then you could wait to see what the public's reaction to it. In a social media era, I think that whole process is more iterative, and I think that there's going to be increased pressure on people to be involved in the discourse long before they have, necessarily all of the facts available to them.
All right, we've only got a couple of minutes left, and you guys always have good behind-the-scenes stories. What's your favorite story of your own that fits into this picture that we're talking about? Kathleen?
Well, I think for sure it's got to be the 2004 Sven Robinson story. He decided to go public and he took control of the message. And if you recall what happened, he stole a ring at an auction and he immediately, or a few days later, basically called a press conference at his constituency office, admitted he stole the ring, retired from public life immediately, went and sought care, and then following that turned himself into the police. I think ultimately what he was choosing is, I'd rather have a cheerful press conference as my final exit than a perp walk, and I think he made the right choice, and that's why he's been able to continue his career as he has.
Important that you pointed out there's a difference between immediately and a couple of days. I mean, he obviously thought that one through and took some advice on it. David?
1993, the Liberals campaigned against the hated GST and promised to scrap it. After several years of trying to find a way to fulfill that promise, they couldn't. There was an increasing clamor for the government to come clean on what its plans were. A lot of people inside the government said, let's redefine our promise and say we only ever promised to replace it. We never promised to scrap it. Well, that would have been the political equivalent of calling people stupid, since everybody had heard what the promise was. Paul Martin decided to go out, acknowledge that there had been a promise made in error, that it had been a promise that should never have been made, and that the promise could not be fulfilled. Explained how they tried to go about finding a solution. In apologizing for it, took the sting out of it for people, and the issue wasn't even a factor in the subsequent election.
It worked for him, not so much for Sheila Copps, who had to run in a by-election because she'd been very...
That's a whole other segment.
Yeah, she'd actually made the commitment she would run again, or she'd quit if it came back. Bill, your story.
Mid-'80s, facing the prospect of a minister accused of conflict of interest. The Prime Minister Mulroney was on an official visit to China, having just completed his attendance at the G8 summit, then G7 in Tokyo. We're literally on the other side of the world. We haven't seen the newscast. We can't read the newspapers. In those days, the technology was limited. Best we could do was sort of fax clippings.
What's that?
Yeah, exactly. And we had to come to some determination of what we were going to do. So we had a window on a Sunday morning. The Prime Minister assembled the senior staff, all of the options, ministerial resignation, commission of inquiry, tough it out, all discussed at some length. At a certain point, after about a couple hours, the then Prime Minister stood up, looked at us, said, "It's Mother's Day, call home, your mother will know what we should do."
And sometimes it is, right? It's not the political advisors, it's the ordinary person who's probably got a better read on things.
Exactly.
So what did Mother say?
The rest, as they say, is history.
All right, Bill, thanks. David, good to see you. Kathleen, good to see you. The Insiders get a bit of a summer break now, but if something comes along, they'll be back. And we'll be back in just a moment with this story. The island of misfit soccer players, teaching aquafit full-time, training in the jungle part-time. We'll introduce you to the only amateur team in the world to make it to FIFA's Confederations Cup.